In ancient days, when the boundary between the visible and invisible world seemed more permeable, there lived in the land of Uz a man named Job. The stories described him as upright, righteous, God-fearing, and free from evil. His life unfolded surrounded by abundance: 7 sons, 3 daughters, thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys, as well as a large household of servants. His reputation spread among caravans and settlements, for everyone considered him the most prosperous man in the East. Each of his days was marked by gratitude, and his nights by sacrifices offered in the name of his children, not out of fear, but out of spiritual caution. However, the narrative suddenly shifted to a celestial realm where the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord. Among them appeared Satan, a figure of accusation whose role was to question human fidelity. When God mentioned Job as an example of righteousness, Satan insinuated that such devotion existed only because Job lived surrounded by prosperity. He proposed a radical test: to strip him of everything to reveal whether his piety was genuine or depended exclusively on the blessings he received. Permission was granted on the condition that his life would not be touched. The succession of misfortunes began in a single day, as if the balance of the world had broken without warning. A messenger arrived with the news that the Sabians had attacked and stolen oxen and donkeys. While he spoke, another reported that a fire from heaven had consumed his sheep and shepherds. A third recounted that the Chaldeans had raided the camels. Before Job could assimilate it, a fourth messenger appeared with the most devastating news. A powerful wind had collapsed the house where his children were celebrating, and all had died. Each announcement fell like an irreversible blow. Job tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground. He did not raise his voice in rebellion. He simply acknowledged that he had come into the world with nothing and could take nothing away. His silence was not resignation, but bewilderment at a reality that had collapsed in an instant. Satan returned before God and claimed that as long as Job's life continued, the test was incomplete. He requested permission to affect him physically and received it with the limit of not killing him. Shortly after, Job found himself covered with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Sitting on the ashes, he took a broken pot to scratch himself. His wife, broken by accumulated suffering, asked him to curse God and die, but Job rejected the idea without understanding the meaning of it all. 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, traveled from distant lands to accompany him. Seeing him from afar, unrecognizable, they tore their robes and mourned with dust on their heads. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking, for his pain was too great to describe. When they finally spoke, they began to insinuate that his suffering must have a hidden moral cause. According to their reasoning, no one suffered so much without having committed some grave sin. Job, weakened physically and emotionally, insisted on his innocence, questioning the meaning of his existence and God's silence. Amid the discussions appeared a 4th interlocutor, Elihu, younger than the others. He interpreted suffering as a means of correction. His words, however, also did not resolve the tension of the narrative. Finally, a whirlwind marked the arrival of the divine voice. God did not explain the causes of Job's suffering. Instead, he confronted him with questions about the origin of the world, the limits of the sea, the nature of wild animals, and the hidden workings of the universe. Job responded by acknowledging his inability to understand. The hand that writes on the wall. The palace of Babylon was illuminated with oil lamps hanging over columns decorated with lions and winged figures. In the great hall, Belshazzar, son of Nabonidus and acting king, held a banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. The sound of harps and flutes filled the air, mixed with the murmur of conversations and the aroma of spices imported from the Persian Gulf. The atmosphere reflected the security of an empire that believed its walls untouchable, fueled by the pride of a city that had withstood sieges for generations. In a gesture of ostentation, Belshazzar ordered the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Temple of Jerusalem during the conquest to be brought. These objects, originally reserved for sacred rites, were placed on tables covered with purple cloths. The king, his wives, and concubines drank from them while toasting gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The pagan ritual, combined with the deliberate desecration of sacred vessels, created an atmosphere of exaltation that increased with each cup served. Then, without warning, the hall fell silent. Near the main candelabrum, a human hand, without an arm, without a body, without a shadow to cast it, appeared writing on the plaster wall. The fingers moved with precision, leaving visible traces that shone under the light. The guests stepped back, spilling wine on the floor as the sound of flutes abruptly stopped. Belshazzar's face lost all color. His knees knocked together and his breathing became labored. The king cried out for magicians, astrologers, and diviners. He promised them purple robes, a gold necklace, and the position of the third ruler of the kingdom if they could read and interpret the inscription. The wise men observed the writing, but none could decipher it. The words did not correspond to any known languages of the region, nor fit the divinatory systems they usually employed in palace rituals. The Queen Mother, hearing the confusion, entered the hall. She advised the king to call Daniel, a Jewish exile who had distinguished himself during Nebuchadnezzar's reign for interpreting dreams and solving enigmas. Daniel was brought before the banquet. His calm demeanor contrasted with the chaos of the hall. Belshazzar offered him the same rewards as the other wise men, but Daniel refused them. Still, he agreed to read the inscription. The wall showed 3 words partially repeated: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Daniel first explained that God had remembered the king's actions, particularly his arrogance in desecrating the temple vessels and his indifference to the lessons Nebuchadnezzar had learned. He then interpreted each term. Mene meant that God had numbered the days of the kingdom and completed them. Tekel indicated that the king had been weighed on the scales and found lacking. Parsin, derived from Perez, announced that the kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The message was an irrevocable sentence. Belshazzar fulfilled his promise. He clothed Daniel in purple and placed a gold necklace around his neck. But the gesture was empty in the face of the magnitude of what had been announced. That same night, the Medo-Persian armies took advantage of a bold strategy. They diverted the course of the Euphrates River and entered through the canals that ran under the walls. Babylon had no time to react. Soldiers advanced through the streets without encountering significant resistance. Belshazzar was killed in his palace, and the kingdom passed into the hands of Darius the Mede. The massacre of the innocents. When Herod the Great ruled Judea under Roman authority, his name was synonymous with power, ambition, and fear. He was a pragmatic king, capable of monumental works like the expansion of the temple, but also of brutal actions to maintain control. Political tension in Jerusalem was constant, and any rumor of a possible messianic leader could ignite instability. In that context, a group of magi from the east arrived asking about the King of the Jews, who had just been born. The city immediately stirred, as the title had religious and political implications that could challenge the existing authority. Herod consulted the priests and scribes of the people, who pointed to the prophecies locating the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem. The king then secretly called the Magi, inquired about the star that had guided them, and asked them to return once they found the child, claiming that he also wished to worship him. His real intention was to identify the newborn and eliminate him before he grew up and was proclaimed leader of the people. The Magi found the child with his mother, presented their gifts, and were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. They took another route back to their land. Upon discovering that he had been bypassed, Herod erupted in fury. The lack of precise information about the child led him to make a decision that would affect an entire community. He ordered the killing of all male children under 2 in Bethlehem and its surroundings, calculating the time according to what he had learned from the Magi. Soldiers moved through the region following direct orders, leaving no room for compassion. At dawn, the village's usual tranquility was interrupted by screams, knocks on doors, and the metallic sound of armor. Men entered houses without warning, searched rooms, and tore the little ones from their mothers' arms. In some homes, desperate resistance ended with more deaths. In others, cries continued even after the soldiers withdrew. Bethlehem, small and accustomed to the slow rhythm of rural life, became a center of collective mourning. The evangelist Matthew, narrating these events, evoked the words of Jeremiah, a voice in Ramah, inconsolable weeping, mothers refusing to accept the death of their children. The text did not detail how many children died or how many families were marked by that order. It only showed the harshness of a policy based on fear, executed to eliminate a threat Herod did not fully understand. Meanwhile, Joseph received a warning in a dream. He had to take Mary and the child and flee to Egypt. The family undertook the journey secretly at night. They crossed desert paths, avoiding monitored routes, seeking refuge in cities where Jewish communities had already been established in earlier times. They stayed there until Herod's death. The flight was not surrounded by visible miracles or invincible protection. It was simply described as the escape of a vulnerable family fleeing state violence. Bethlehem continued its life after the event, but the memory of the episode persisted in later generations. The houses that had lost their little ones continued to function, but the silence left by the void was profound. The texts recorded no tributes or governmental responses. History moved forward without pausing to name the children. The event remained inscribed as an act of unchecked power, motivated by fear of an enemy who was just beginning his life. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah stretched across the Jordan Plain, a fertile region that contrasted with the arid lands surrounding it. Their crops thrived, trade flowed along caravan routes, and the inhabitants lived confidently in the stability provided by their strategic location. In older accounts, that valley was described as the Lord's Garden, a place where water flowed abundantly and shepherds found pastures without difficulty. However, the fame of these cities had darkened over the years, marked by violent practices, abuses against foreigners, and a general disregard for justice. Abraham, who lived in the nearby hills, received a visit from 3 mysterious figures. 2 of them descended to Sodom, while the third announced that the outcry against the city had become unbearable. Abraham interceded, asking if the city would be destroyed even if there were righteous people within it, but the conversation did not continue with details. The narrative turned attention to the 2 messengers who arrived in Sodom at dusk, when daylight began to fade over the walls. Lot, settled near the city gate, saw them arrive and bowed in respect. He invited them to stay in his house, insisting even when they seemed to prefer sleeping in the square. Aware of the danger strangers faced at night, Lot brought them into his home, prepared a meal, and closed the doors. The calm lasted little. Men from the city surrounded the house, demanding that he hand over the visitors. They did not ask for explanations, they commanded. Lot went out, tried to reason with them, and offered desperate alternatives, but the crowd did not disperse. They began to push the door to break it down. The visitors intervened, stretched out their hand, took Lot, and brought him quickly into the house. Then they blinded the men outside, disorienting them as they searched unsuccessfully for the entrance. With the urgency of those who know an imminent danger, the messengers told Lot he had to gather his family and leave the city. The destruction was decreed. Lot spoke with the future husbands of his daughters, but they thought he was joking and did not listen. At first light, the messengers urged Lot to depart without delay. His wife and daughters accompanied him. The instruction was clear: escape without looking back. Lot asked permission to take refuge in a small town called Zoar, and the request was granted. Barely arriving safely, a rain of fire and sulfur fell upon Sodom, Gomorrah, and the surrounding cities. The plain that had once been fertile was engulfed in flames. The text did not detail whether people had time to flee. It only mentioned that the destruction was total. During the escape, Lot's wife turned her gaze toward the city. No one spoke to her or tried to stop her. She simply looked. The narrative states that she became a pillar of salt. Her final moments or the exact reason for the gesture are not described, only her final fate fixed at a point along the path. Lot arrived in Zoar with his daughters, but fear that the destruction might spread led him to seek refuge in the mountains. There, in an isolated cave, they lived for a time without contact with other inhabitants. His daughters, convinced that the world had become deserted, took wine and intoxicated their father, each conceiving a son. Those children, Moab and Ben-Ami, became the ancestors of peoples who occupied territories east of the Jordan. The plain that had once been seen as a garden was left desolate, and the cities disappeared under a landscape that no longer bore resemblance to the former world. The locusts from the abyss in Revelation. When John wrote on the island of Patmos his visions of the apocalypse, he described scenes that exceeded the limits of human experience. Among them, the opening of the abyss's pit stood out for its symbolic and visual power. The vision began with the fall of a star, not a physical celestial body, but a spiritual being to whom the key to the bottomless pit was given. When he opened that abyss, A column of dark smoke rose to the sky, darkening the sun as if a monumental fire had erupted beneath the Earth's surface. From the smoke emerged creatures that John described with the most precise language he could find. They looked like locusts, but did not behave like ordinary insects. They were not intended to destroy plants or trees. Their mission was to torment men for 5 months. Their appearance combined features of different beings. They had shapes resembling horses prepared for battle, suggesting speed and aggressiveness. On their heads they bore something like golden crowns, and their faces resembled those of human beings, a feature that gave the vision an even more disturbing element. Their hair fell like that of women, a detail that contrasted with their teeth, described as lion-like. They wore iron breastplates, and their wings produced a deafening sound, like the roar of war chariots rushing into battle. The description became increasingly disturbing when mentioning their scorpion-like tails, equipped with stingers capable of causing extreme pain. The wound did not kill, but the intensity of the torment brought men to the brink of despair. John said that many would seek death in those days, but death would flee from them. These creatures had a king, something unusual, since locusts in nature do not have a defined leader. Their leader was the Angel of the Abyss, called Abaddon in Hebrew and Apollyon in Greek, both names associated with destruction. The authority of this figure suggested an internal order among those hosts of the abyss, far from animal chaos. During the 5 months of their activity, the locusts could harm only those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. No method was mentioned to escape them, nor any refuge capable of stopping their attacks. John observed the scene as if the sky had opened to show a hidden dimension where hybrid creatures carried out a devastating mandate. Their combined forms made it clear that they belonged to a sphere alien to the known nature, and the noise of their wings, like that of chariots in battle, completed the image of an invasion that did not come from human armies, but from the very bottom of the abyss. The 10 Plagues of Egypt. The confrontation between Moses and the Pharaoh of Egypt took place in a political context where Hebrew labor supported part of the national economy. The Israelites had gone from a migrant clan to a numerous people, and that growth aroused suspicion on the throne. When Moses returned from Midian proclaiming that the God of Israel commanded the liberation of his people, the Pharaoh's response was to increase the labor burdens, denying any negotiation. From that moment, according to the account, a sequence of phenomena began that transformed the life of the empire. The first plague affected the heart of the country, the Nile. Its waters turned to blood, the fish died, and the river emitted an unbearable odor. The Egyptians dug along the banks to obtain drinking water, while their priests tried to imitate the phenomenon with magical arts. The second plague brought frogs that invaded palaces, houses, and temples. No surface was free from their presence. The third plague consisted of lice or mosquitoes that covered animals and people, even affecting the pharaoh's sorcerers, who acknowledged that this was beyond their power. In the fourth plague, swarms of flying insects darkened the air. Then a deadly disease affected the Egyptian livestock, while the Israelites' animals remained healthy. The sixth plague brought sores that covered the bodies of men and beasts. With the seventh came a hailstorm mixed with fire that destroyed crops, houses, and anything exposed to the open sky. The eighth plague summoned locusts that devoured what little remained standing. Egyptian officials begged the pharaoh to give in, stating that Egypt was lost, but the refusal persisted. Then the ninth plague plunged the empire into dense darkness for 3 days, while in the houses of the Israelites there was light. The difference between the two peoples was accentuated. The 10th plague closed the cycle. At midnight, death swept through Egypt and took all the firstborn. The houses were filled with laments, from the pharaoh's family to the prisoners' families. Amid the general mourning, the pharaoh ordered the Israelites to leave the country without delay. That night marked the beginning of the Exodus and the end of Egyptian power over that people. The Great Flood. In the ancient accounts of Genesis, the world had reached a point where corruption spread everywhere. Violence filled the earth, and human conduct had deviated so much that creation seemed unrecognizable. Noah, a descendant of Adam through Seth, stood out in that scenario for his righteousness. He was described as a righteous man in his generation, someone whose life maintained an internal order in a time when human behavior had lost all moral orientation. The story began with a statement without emotional details. The end of all beings was approaching. Noah received specific instructions to build an ark. The structure had to measure 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. It had to have a top window, a door on one side, and 3 internal levels. The wood had to be coated with pitch inside and out to ensure its buoyancy. There was no mention of how Noah obtained the materials or how long it took to erect such a vast construction, but the image of the ark standing on dry land must have become a point of curiosity for those who saw it rise without understanding its purpose. In the midst of preparation, Noah received the command to gather the animals. From each species, he had to take a male and a female. From certain animals considered pure, he had to take 7 pairs. As the ark was completed, the animals began to arrive. The account did not detail the paths nor how they were guided, only stating that they entered 2 by 2 into the enormous vessel. The scene must have been strange for those who inhabited the region, creatures of various species and sizes moving toward a structure that seemed too large for any common use. When everything was ready, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives entered the ark. The text notes that it was God who closed the door from the outside. Then the storm began. The gates of heaven and the fountains of the abyss were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights without interruption. As the water rose, the men and animals outside the vessel died. The valleys filled, the trees were submerged, and the mountains disappeared beneath the rising waters. The ark floated over a landscape that had lost all reference. For months, Noah and his family lived in a darkness interrupted only by internal lamps. The sound of water striking the wooden structure accompanied each day. There were no windows to see the outside, except the top opening. When the intensity of the storm subsided, the waters remained at their maximum level for 150 days. Only then did they begin to decrease. The ark finally stopped on the mountains of Ararat, although the land was still not dry. Noah waited patiently. He opened the top window and let out a raven, which flew back and forth without returning. Then he released a dove, which returned without finding rest. 7 days later, he repeated the gesture, and the dove returned with an olive leaf in its beak, a sign that the waters had receded enough to reveal vegetation. 1 week later, the dove did not return. The land was slowly emerging from the flood. When the ground dried, Noah removed the coverings from the ark. The fresh air must have entered as a reminder of a world that had been erased and now reappeared silently. Noah went out with his family and the animals, who scattered as the wind renewed the landscape. The previous structures, roads, and settlements had disappeared under a terrain transformed by the immense expanse of water, with no visible traces of the life that once occupied those valleys. The judgment of God against Jerusalem, Ezekiel. When Jerusalem still resisted, besieged by forces that seemed inevitable, Ezekiel lived in exile by the Cheba River, in Babylonian territory. He was not part of the direct military events, but he received visions that brutally recounted what was about to happen. His messages did not have the softness of symbolic metaphors. They were images that emerged with the sharpness of molten metal and fire-consuming structures that once seemed permanent. Everything began with an accusation. The city had become a furnace where the people's waste accumulated, compared to copper, tin, iron, and lead covered with impurities. The impending judgment would not be a simple military defeat, but a process of total melting. Ezekiel observed the visions from his provisional home in exile. The figures he saw did not follow human rules. There were living beings with 4 wings, 4 faces, and movements that went in multiple directions without turning their heads. Intertwined wheels covered with eyes followed the steps of these creatures, while a kind of metallic radiance filled the air with a sound like waters striking rocks. In the midst of this scene, divine glory appeared, moved and rose, as if the presence of God were moving from a place about to be definitively abandoned. In one of the harshest visions, Ezekiel saw the human figure representing the Lord's glory, ordering a man dressed in linen to go through the city, marking those who sighed over the injustices committed in Jerusalem. Behind him came 6 armed men. They were ordered to traverse the city starting from the temple and kill indiscriminately those who had not been marked. The narrative did not dwell on the details of the act. It only presented the command and its execution, making clear that the judgment began in the holiest place. Another image showed Jerusalem as a huge pot where the flesh, symbolizing the population, slowly boiled. The blood spilled in the streets was not hidden. It remained exposed on the stones, turned into evidence against the city. The leaders gave security speeches while the threat advanced meter by meter. Ezekiel, from a distance, saw smoke rise as a sign announcing not only military defeat, but the rupture of the relationship between the city and its god. In previous years, the inhabitants had sought alliances with Egypt and other nations to avoid Babylonian domination. The temple prophets assured that the city would not fall because it housed the sanctuary. But Ezekiel described the opposite. Divine glory in his visions rose from the temple, stopped on the threshold, moved toward the eastern gate, and finally departed from the city. The temple was left empty before the invaders could profane it. The defeat was not only political, it was spiritual. When Babylonian troops broke the walls, hunger had been devouring the population for months. The scenes described by Ezekiel were reflected in reality: burning houses, the city plundered, the temple set on fire, sacred utensils taken as loot, and survivors marching into exile. In his visions, the city had been placed in a fiery crucible. In history, the fire consumed its beams and doors. The prophet received fragmented news, but his visions had already shown everything before it happened. His role was not to console or explain, only to recount what he had seen: images where Jerusalem appeared as metal subjected to a relentless smelting, a city where every stone seemed to testify against itself. The Passion and Torture of Christ. The last night of Jesus before his arrest took place in the Garden of Gethsemane, at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The atmosphere was tense. Jerusalem was crowded with pilgrims for the Passover festival, and the religious authorities feared that any unexpected movement could provoke disturbances. In this context, a group of soldiers and temple guards, guided by Judas Iscariot, arrived at the garden with torches and weapons. Jesus was identified by an everyday gesture, a greeting that under normal circumstances would have gone unnoticed. The arrest was carried out without organized resistance. First brought before the Sanhedrin, Jesus faced accusations of blasphemy and of proclaiming an authority incompatible with the existing religious structure. The trial took place at dawn, with contradictory witnesses and questions designed to elicit a statement that would justify a conviction. After this process, he was handed over to Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, since only Rome had the authority to impose the death penalty. Pilate interrogated Jesus, assessed the political situation, and realized that the religious leaders sought to eliminate him to avoid tensions between the people and the institutions. Despite his apparent reluctance, he yielded to the pressure of the crowd. He then ordered that Jesus be flogged before the crucifixion. Roman flogging was not a symbolic punishment. It was carried out with a flagrum composed of leather straps containing pieces of bone and metal. Tied to a column, Jesus received blows that tore his back and sides, leaving deep, continuously bleeding gashes. The soldiers, mocking the accusation that he claimed to be king, placed a crown of thorns on his head and a purple robe over his lacerated shoulders. They beat him, spat on him, and bowed to him in a mock display of reverence. Then they led him to the place of execution, known as Golgotha. The cross, heavy and rough, rested on his wounded shoulders. Jesus moved along narrow streets, followed by soldiers and onlookers. At one point, weakened by blood loss, he fell repeatedly. A man named Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the cross to complete the journey. At Golgotha, Jesus was stripped of his garments, which the soldiers cast lots for. He was laid on the wood and fixed with nails in his wrists and feet. The crucifixion was designed to prolong suffering. The body was suspended in a position that made breathing difficult. Each attempt to inhale required pushing upward, causing pain in the nails and whip wounds. The bystanders' reactions were divided between insults, mockery, and the silence of those who watched without intervening. Above the cross, an inscription indicated the reason for the sentence: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. 2 criminals were crucified alongside him. During the following hours, the sky darkened. The scene unfolded without visible signs of release. Soldiers stood watch to ensure that no one attempted to intervene. The crowd fluctuated, some returning home while others remained near the place. At the end of the afternoon, Jesus cried out one last time and died. A soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm his death. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who had remained silent during the trial, requested permission to remove the body. Together with Nicodemus, he wrapped it in linens with aromatic spices and placed it in a new tomb carved into the rock. A large stone was rolled to seal the entrance. The city continued its life while the body remained in the darkness of the tomb, wrapped in burial cloths. The Lake of Fire. In the last chapters of the Apocalypse, John described a scenario situated beyond human experience, a territory where time, judgment, and existence seemed to follow different laws. There, after multiple visions of catastrophes, heavenly battles, and the fall of symbolic kingdoms, appeared the Lake of Fire, a burning expanse that was not part of the traditional earthly or heavenly geography. It was neither a mountain, nor an abyss, nor a valley. It was a final destination. The narrative began with the defeat of the dragon, a figure associated with Satan, who had influenced kings, nations, and armies throughout the vision. After a period described as 1,000 years, during which the enemy remained chained in a deep abyss, he was released for a brief time. That release triggered a global movement. Nations, symbolically called Gog and Magog, gathered in countless numbers. The goal was not to conquer territory, but to confront the beloved city, a place that represented the center of divine fidelity. The battle, however, did not unfold conventionally. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the gathered forces without any physical confrontation being described. After that defeat, the dragon was taken to the lake of fire and sulfur. There were already the beast and the false prophet, figures who had been previously thrown there after one of the earlier visions. The account gave no indications about the appearance of the lake, its extent, or its intensity. It simply described it as a place where torment did not cease. There was no reference to rest, intervals, or the passage of time. The key phrase was that they would be tormented day and night forever and ever. It did not explain how time operated in that dimension. After this act, John described a great white throne. The scene had no landscape, only the presence of the throne and the figure seated on it. Heaven and earth fled from its presence, an expression that implied that all creation recoiled at that moment. The dead, great and small, appeared before the throne. Books were opened, recording the actions of each individual. There was no mention of defense, advocate, or argument, only facts. Another book, called the Book of Life, determined the final fate of people. Those not registered in it were thrown into the lake of fire. There were also thrown Death and Hades, personifications of the forces that had dominated humanity since the beginning of the world. The lake thus became the point where even abstract powers met an end. The text did not describe screams or emotional reactions. It also did not explain the spatial location of the lake or its origin. There were no surrounding landscapes, no lights, no explicit darkness. Only a burning surface conceived as an irreversible destiny. The narrative called it the second death, differentiating it from the physical death that affected living beings. This second death was final. No cycles, restorations, or intervals were mentioned. The lake appeared only at specific moments of the vision, without linguistic adornments or detailed descriptions. It functioned as the ultimate limit of all previously presented judgments. Thus, the image remained fixed, a burning expanse where symbolic and human figures were sent after being evaluated according to the records of their actions. The account did not add further details or transitions, leaving the scene as a final destination within the set of John's apocalyptic visions. The beheading of John the Baptist. In the time of Herod Antipas, John the Baptist had become an uncomfortable figure for political power. His preaching in the desert, direct and uncompromising, openly denounced the Tetrarch's marriage to Herodias, his brother's wife. Herod feared the influence John had over the people, and although he considered him a righteous man, he had him imprisoned in the fortress of Machaerus to prevent a possible uprising. Herodias, offended by the accusations, awaited an opportunity to silence him permanently. That opportunity came during Herod's birthday celebration. Nobles, soldiers, and regional leaders attended the banquet, where wine and music enlivened the evening. In the midst of the feast, the young Salome, daughter of Herodias, entered to dance before the guests. Her performance pleased Herod so much that, carried away by enthusiasm and the desire to show generosity, he promised her anything she asked, even half of the kingdom. Influenced by her mother, Salome asked without hesitation for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The Tetrarch was caught between the oath he had made before his guests and the fear of contradicting the young girl. Although saddened, he ordered that the request be fulfilled. An executioner descended to the dungeon where John awaited his fate and executed him. His head was brought on a platter to the banquet and given to the young girl, who in turn gave it to her mother. John's disciples collected his body and buried it, then brought the news to Jesus. Baby killings in the Psalms, Psalm 137. Psalm 137 arose in one of the most painful moments for the people of Israel, the exile in Babylon. Sitting by the rivers of that foreign land, the deportees remembered Jerusalem with a nostalgia mingled with grief. The conquerors demanded songs and joy, as if defeat could be turned into entertainment. The psalmist responded that hanging up the harps was the only possible option, for singing about Zion in a land of oppression was to betray the pain. Amid the plea to remember Jerusalem, the psalm took an abrupt turn toward the desire for justice. The author invoked the fall of Babylon and asked that divine judgment reach those who had destroyed the holy city. The emotional tension grew until it culminated in a brutal phrase, "Blessed is the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks." The expression reflected the intensity of the trauma experienced, for the Babylonians had practiced that same violence when taking Jerusalem, killing indiscriminately during the final invasion. The psalmist's cry did not appear as an instruction, but as a desperate lament of a people who had lost everything and witnessed horrors that marked generations. The phrase showed the emotional harshness of exile and the incapacity of a defeated people to think of reconciliation while the ruins of their city still smoldered in memory. The revenge mentioned arose as an image that returned in words the same cruelty they had suffered. "You dare attack children for mocking Elisha." The story of Elisha began after Elijah's departure in a whirlwind, when the young prophet assumed the spiritual leadership of Israel. Shortly after receiving his master's mantle, he set out on a journey to Bethel, a city that had once been a center of idolatrous practices and religious tensions. As he walked along the road, a large group of boys came out of the city and began mocking him. The voices echoed with contempt, "Go up, bald head, go up," ironically referring to Elijah's ascension and ridiculing Elisha's appearance. Those taunts were not mere childish insults. The term used suggested groups of young men old enough to understand the meaning of their provocations and the hostility of the region towards the Lord's prophets. Elisha stopped, turned toward them, and stared at them. Then he pronounced a curse in the name of God, without raising his voice, but with a solemnity that marked a boundary between the group's irreverence and the spiritual authority he represented. Immediately, 2 female bears came out of the nearby forest and attacked 42 of the boys. The narrative did not provide details about how long the attack lasted or the reaction of the city, but the number of injured showed the magnitude of the event. Elisha continued on his way without stopping, leaving behind a scene that must have provoked fear and shock throughout the region. Cannibal mothers during the siege. During the Syrian siege of Samaria, the city was trapped between exhausted walls and an enemy that simply waited for hunger to do the work for them. As the days passed, food disappeared and prices reached unimaginable levels. A donkey's head was sold for a huge amount of silver, and pigeon dung became a survival resource. The streets were silent, broken only by moans and quarrels, while inside the houses, hunger devoured any trace of hope. One day, as the king of Israel walked along the wall, a woman cried out for justice. The monarch, exhausted by the collective misery, asked her to explain her anguish. The woman recounted that, together with another mother, they had made a desperate pact to eat the son of one of them today and the other's son the next day. On the first day, they killed and cooked the child of the woman who was speaking. But when the next day came, the other mother hid her child and broke the agreement. The woman demanded that the king intervene. Upon hearing the story, the monarch tore his clothes in horror. Underneath, he wore a sackcloth, evidence of his own silent suffering. The scene revealed how far despair had reached within the city, where the siege had not only caused hunger, but had shattered the last human bonds. The king, on the verge of emotional collapse, blamed the prophet Elisha for the calamity and vowed to kill him, convinced that God had withdrawn his favor. Elisha, for his part, announced that the siege would end the next day and that food prices would drop drastically, although an officer doubted the prophecy. Liberation came unexpectedly. The Syrians fled during the night after hearing sounds they interpreted as a powerful army approaching. Samaria found the enemy camps abandoned and full of provisions. The beasts of the apocalypse. In the visions John received on Patmos, the creatures of the apocalypse appeared in forms that surpassed any reference to the natural world. One of the first descriptions centered around the heavenly throne, living beings with multiple wings and covered with eyes inside and out. Each had a distinct face with features like a lion, a calf, a man, and an eagle, proclaiming divine holiness day and night without interruption. That strange and majestic presence marked the beginning of a chain of images that would become increasingly disturbing. Later, John saw a beast rising from the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns, adorned with crowns and inscribed with names of blasphemy. Its appearance combined traits of a leopard, bear, and lion, and it received authority from a dragon that supported it. One of its heads seemed mortally wounded, but it healed, causing astonishment and fear among the nations. The beast acted with power, persecuted the saints, and extended its influence over every tribe and people. Then another beast appeared, this time rising from the earth, with 2 horns like a lamb, but with the voice of a dragon. It deceived the inhabitants of the world with signs and wonders, commanding the construction of an image of the previous beast and giving life to that image so that it spoke and issued judgments. Its control extended to economic activities, as it imposed a mark without which no one could buy or sell. The visions alternated between symbols, threats, and judgments, each accompanied by intense language. The creatures described did not stop at hybrid forms. Winged beings carrying plagues also appeared, horses whose riders brought death, and angels who poured bowls of wrath upon the earth. Altogether, the beasts of the apocalypse represented a parade of images traversing the boundary between the celestial and the monstrous, the judgment of Solomon. In the early days of Solomon's reign, when his fame was just beginning to spread throughout Israel, 2 women came before him with a case that seemed impossible to resolve. Both lived in the same house and had given birth just a few days apart. During the night, one woman's son died, and according to the account, she took the living child of the other woman and placed him beside her while she slept, leaving the dead child in the other woman's lap. At dawn, both claimed to be the mother of the living child, and there were no witnesses or evidence to favor either of them. The king listened to both versions as the tension in the courtroom grew. The dispute was not about wealth or property, but about a defenseless baby caught between 2 irreconcilable claims. Solomon, aware that the truth had to be revealed beyond words and gestures, requested a sword. He ordered that the child be cut in 2 and half, given to each woman. The proposal struck the room like a blow. The woman whose child was alive begged that the child be given to the other as long as he would not die. In contrast, the other woman accepted the division, insisting that the baby belonged to neither. Seeing their reactions, Solomon stopped the act and declared, "The true mother was the one willing to give up the child rather than see him die." He ordered that the baby be immediately handed over to her. The verdict quickly spread throughout Israel, showing that the king's wisdom was not only in knowledge, but in the ability to reveal the human heart through unexpected decisions. The episode remained as a testimony of a judgment that, without shedding blood, revealed the truth with a single command. Zipporah circumcises her son with a stone. On the way to Egypt, as Moses was returning to face the Pharaoh with the divine message, a sudden and bewildering episode occurred at an inn. The text recounted that God came out to meet Moses to kill him, without providing any immediate explanation. The scene, abrupt and enigmatic, took an unexpected turn when Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife, acted quickly. She took a sharp stone and circumcised their youngest son, an act connected to the covenant established with Abraham and required as a sign of belonging to God's people. In the urgency, Zipporah cut the boy's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it, saying, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." The narrative offered no interpretations or explanations, only that after this gesture, God ceased attacking Moses. The episode indicated that the lack of circumcision had put the family in mortal danger, although the text remained silent about the spiritual or symbolic reasons behind it. What is certain is that Zipporah, acting without hesitation at a critical moment, prevented her husband's death through a ritual act that should have been performed long before. After the intervention, the journey continued to Egypt, where Moses would reunite with his brother Aaron and present to the Pharaoh the demand to free the people. The inn scene remained shrouded in mystery, notable for its intensity and the unexpected prominence of Zipporah at a decisive moment. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. In the exile of Babylon, Ezekiel received one of the most striking visions in all prophetic literature. The Spirit took him to a valley full of scattered bones, dried by the passage of time and showing no trace of life. The prophet walked among them, observing their number and condition. They were completely disjointed human remains, unable to suggest any identifiable past. The silence surrounding that valley contrasted with the magnitude of desolation. Then God asked Ezekiel if those bones could live. The prophet replied that only God knew. In response to that confession of uncertainty, he was commanded to prophesy over the bones. When Ezekiel spoke, a sound began to run through the valley. The bones moved, drew closer to one another, and began to join together. Tendons appeared on them, then flesh, then skin, but they still had no breath. At a second command, God ordered the prophet to call the Spirit to blow from the four winds. When Ezekiel spoke the words, the breath entered those bodies, and they rose as a numerous, firm, and complete army. The valley that had once been a symbol of absolute death transformed into a scene of physical restoration, as if time and decay had been reversible. God explained that the vision represented the whole house of Israel, whose inhabitants said they felt like dry bones, hopeless, and without a future. The promise was that they would return to their land and regain life as a nation. Yet the impact of the scene went beyond the explanation. A valley full of death turned into a field where thousands of bodies came to life at the same time. The fall of Samaria, Hosea. In the time of the prophet Hosea, the northern kingdom, known as Israel or Ephraim, was immersed in political and spiritual decay that brought it ever closer to destruction. Uncertain alliances with foreign powers, persistent idolatry, and internal corruption weakened Samaria, its capital. Hosea, witness to this deterioration, announced an imminent judgment that would affect not only the city, but also its most vulnerable population. The prophet described a day when Samaria would be stormed. In that moment of chaos, the walls would fall, and the ramparts would not stop the invaders. Pregnant women would be opened in the streets, and young children would be torn apart without mercy. The scene appeared without softness or cover, like a direct portrait of what happens when a city, unable to sustain itself, succumbs to armies that make no distinction between combatants and civilians. The violence described by Hosea was not limited to physical attack. It also reflected the moral collapse of a people who had abandoned their spiritual and political responsibilities. The Assyrian invasion, which indeed arrived in the 8th century BCE, confirmed the prophet's warnings. Samaria was besieged for 3 years, and when it finally fell, many of its inhabitants were deported, while others perished at the hands of enemy soldiers. Hosea's message showed the harshness of punishment in ancient warfare, where the defenselessness of children and the vulnerability of women were inevitable consequences of social collapse. The fall of Samaria was recorded as a moment of total rupture in which a once prosperous capital became a symbol of abandonment and devastation. Abuse against Dinah. Dinah, daughter of Leah and Jacob, went out to visit the women of the region while the family was camping in the lands of Shechem. During that visit, Shechem, son of the local ruler Hamor, saw her and became enamored of her. According to the account, he took her by force and then tried to persuade her with words of affection. The incident left the young woman in a position of total vulnerability, marked by the initial violence and Shechem's subsequent insistence on making her his wife. Hamor and his son went to Jacob to formally request the marriage. They proposed alliances, exchanges, and coexistence between the two communities. Jacob remained silent, waiting for his sons, who, upon learning of the outrage, reacted with indignation and deceit. Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, accepted the proposal under one condition, that all the men of the town be circumcised, thus adopting the sign of identity of the Israelite clan. Hamor and Shechem persuaded their people to comply with the demand, promising economic and social benefits. 3 days later, when the pain of circumcision was at its peak, Simeon and Levi entered the city and killed all the men, including Hamor and Shechem. They plundered houses, took flocks, goods, and women, leaving the city devastated. Dinah was rescued and removed from the place by her brothers. Jacob, upon learning the magnitude of the revenge, feared the repercussions the family would face from neighboring communities as the acts of Simeon and Levi put them in danger against hostile coalitions. The account left the scene charged with moral and political tension, offering neither relief nor peaceful resolution. Elijah executes the 450 prophets of Baal. In the time of King Ahab, Israel was divided between the worship of the god of their fathers and the growing cult of Baal promoted by Queen Jezebel. Elijah, the prophet of the Lord, lived as a fugitive while religious persecution advanced. After years of drought, he left his hiding place and challenged Ahab to gather the people on Mount Carmel along with the prophets of Baal. The atmosphere was tense, a single prophet facing hundreds representing the official religion of the palace. The challenge was to prepare 2 altars, one for Baal and one for the Lord, without lighting fire. The God who responded with fire from heaven would be recognized as true. The prophets of Baal sacrificed their bull and began to cry out from morning until noon, jumping around the altar, cutting themselves with knives and spears as was their ritual custom. There was no response. Elijah, observing, ironically urged them to shout louder, suggesting that perhaps their God was asleep. By evening, Elijah repaired the Lord's altar with 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel. He dug a trench around it, placed the wood and the sacrifice, and ordered everything to be soaked with water until the trench was full. Then he prayed briefly. In response, fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water. The people fell face down to the ground upon witnessing the scene. Elijah took advantage of the moment to give a firm order to seize the prophets of Baal. They were taken to the Kishon Brook, where the prophet executed them. The exact sequence was not detailed, but the magnitude of the act made it clear that it was a mass slaughter carried out in a valley near Mount Carmel. As the sky began to cloud over, signaling the end of the drought, the brook carried away the evidence of that religious purge, the Levite and his dismembered concubine. In the days when there was no king in Israel, a Levite living in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem of Judah. After an argument, the woman returned to her father's house, and the Levite traveled to convince her to come back. After several days of hospitality extended by her father-in-law, they set out on the return journey. When night fell, they decided to stay in Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin. An old man offered them shelter, knowing they would not be safe in the town square. However, men of the city surrounded the house, demanded that the Levite come out, and provoked a violent situation reminiscent of the events in Sodom. To protect himself, the Levite handed over his concubine, and the woman was abused throughout the night. At dawn, she lay by the door of the house, unable to rise. The Levite opened the door and found her motionless. He placed her on his donkey and returned home. There he took a knife and cut her body into 12 pieces, sending each part to one of the tribes of Israel as an extreme denunciation of the atrocity committed. The message caused national shock. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the land. The tribes gathered to demand justice and held the inhabitants of Gibeah responsible. When the Benjaminites refused to hand over the guilty, a civil war broke out that almost wiped out the entire tribe. Only a few men survived, and the remaining tribes had to find a way to prevent their complete disappearance, resorting to desperate measures to ensure the continuity of the lineage. Biblical approval of slavery. In the legislation of Exodus, as the people of Israel progressed in their social and religious formation, rules appeared to regulate slavery. These laws did not question the institution itself. They took it for granted and established the terms under which it could be exercised. A Hebrew could become a servant due to debt or poverty, serving for 6 years and obtaining freedom in the 7th. However, if at the end of the period he wished to stay voluntarily, a ritual was performed in which his ear was pierced against the door, marking his permanent condition. The laws also addressed the situation of foreign slaves, who could be acquired as inheritable property. Unlike Hebrews, they had no time limit for their service. The texts acknowledged the existence of violence within this structure. If a master struck a servant and killed him, it was considered a crime. But if death occurred days later, the punishment was mitigated because the servant was his property. Other passages mention that if a slave lost an eye or a tooth due to a blow, he should receive freedom as compensation. The regulations reflected a social order where slavery was an institution integrated into everyday life. The differences between Hebrew and foreign slaves, partial protections and limited punishments, showed a rigid hierarchy. The texts did not soften the reality of the power a master had over his servant, nor did they hide the tensions that could arise in that relationship. These laws coexisted with others that regulated festivals, sacrifices, and community organization, but stood out for their severity compared to later sensibilities. The institution was presented unadorned as a structural part of the ancient world: persecution and execution of non-believers. In the book of Deuteronomy, when Israel was preparing to enter the Promised Land, the instructions given through Moses included severe mandates aimed at protecting the religious identity of the people. Among them were strict rules against anyone attempting to lead others into the worship of foreign gods. The warning was not limited to external enemies. It could involve a brother, a son, a beloved wife, or a close friend. The text commanded that if someone secretly whispered an invitation to serve other gods, that person had to be reported without hesitation. After a rigorous investigation, and if the accusation was confirmed, the punishment was death by stoning. The severity was based on the idea that allowing idolatry threatened the cohesion of the people and their relationship with God. Even an entire city could be destroyed if it was discovered that its inhabitants had been seduced by foreign cults. The legislation demanded not only external obedience but absolute loyalty. There was no room to tolerate religious deviations in a society where faith was tied to national survival. In this context, the execution of those promoting different beliefs was presented as an act of purification and protection, preventing idolatry from spreading and weakening the people. The emphasis on religious exclusivity was repeated in various passages, showing a time when spiritual identity and political security were inseparable. The narrative left no room for lenient interpretations, as the command was explicit in its final outcome. Death of those who looked at the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, built in the time of Moses according to precise instructions, was considered the most sacred object of Israel. Its interior held the tablets of the law, and its presence was associated with the divine power that accompanied the people. Because of its holiness, only designated Levites could carry it, and even they had to follow a strict protocol to avoid touching or looking at it directly. Any violation of these rules brought immediate consequences. During the period of the Judges, the Ark was captured by the Philistines after Israel's defeat at Ebenezer. However, its presence caused disease and chaos in the cities where it was taken, so the Philistines returned it on a cart drawn by cows. The ark arrived at Beth Shemesh, where the inhabitants rejoiced upon seeing it. But some, driven by curiosity, tried to look inside it. The text recounts that God struck them, and around 70 people died because of that act of irreverence. Later, during the reign of David, another episode occurred. While the king was transporting the ark to Jerusalem, the cart carrying it wobbled upon reaching an uneven part of the road. Uzzah, one of the men responsible for the transport, reached out to steady it and prevent it from falling. Although his impulse seemed reasonable, the gesture violated the absolute prohibition against touching the ark. In the act, Uzzah fell dead beside it. The transport was interrupted, and David, overwhelmed, temporarily placed the ark in the house of Obed-Edom. The image of the ark, associated with divine favor, also became a reminder of the danger of approaching it without proper reverence. The death of those who looked at it and the sudden fall of Uzzah revealed an unnegotiable boundary regarding the sacred. Stoning as punishment. In biblical legislation, stoning appeared as one of the most forceful and frequent communal punishments. It was not an act reserved for authorities or judges, but a procedure in which the entire community participated. The penalty was applied to offenses considered especially serious: idolatry, blasphemy, adultery, rebellion against parents, and certain prohibited sexual behaviors. The purpose was not only to punish, but to eradicate what was perceived as a threat to the spiritual and social cohesion of Israel. One of the best-known cases arose in the book of Leviticus, where it was ordered that those who blasphemed against the name of God be taken outside the camp and stoned to death. The scene was described in detail. Witnesses were to throw the first stones, followed by the rest of the people. This detail showed the shared responsibility in carrying out the punishment, preventing the death from falling into the hands of a single individual. Another example appeared in Deuteronomy, where the rebellious son was mentioned. A stubborn young man who did not obey his father or mother and persisted in destructive behavior after being corrected. The parents could bring him before the elders of the city and accuse him publicly. If the behavior was confirmed, the men of the people stoned him to remove the evil from among you. Again, the measure was presented without nuance as part of the social structure of the ancient world. Stoning was also applied in cases of adultery. The book of Deuteronomy established that if a betrothed woman was found with another man in the city and did not seek help, both were to be stoned. In rural areas, only the man was punished if it was proven that the woman had been forced. These norms reflected a legal system where sexuality, family honor, and community identity were intertwined with extreme consequences. The practice remained in force for centuries, even in New Testament times, when religious groups tried to stone Jesus and later brought an adulterous woman before him to test him. Punishment for others' sins. David's son dies. After the episode with Bathsheba, King David tried to cover up his wrongdoing by arranging the return of Uriah, the woman's husband, from the battlefield. When Uriah refused to go home out of respect for military discipline, David sent a letter to Joab, the army commander, ordering him to place Uriah at the most dangerous point in battle to ensure his death. Uriah fell in battle, and after the mourning period, David took Bathsheba as his wife. However, the prophet Nathan came to the palace and told a parable that revealed the king's crime. He narrated the story of a rich man who, instead of taking one of his many sheep to honor a visitor, stole the only sheep of a poor man. When David condemned the rich man in the parable, Nathan declared, "You are that man." Divine judgment was pronounced without delay. Among the announced consequences, one warning stood out above all. The child born from the union with Bathsheba would die. Shortly after the warning, the child became seriously ill. David fasted, dressed in sackcloth, and spent entire nights on the ground begging for his son's life. The elders of the palace tried to lift him, but he refused. For 7 days, the king remained in supplication and silence, seeking to reverse what Nathan had foretold. On the 7th day, the child died. The servants feared to inform him, but when David learned, he got up, washed, changed his clothes, and went to the temple to worship. He then returned home and ate, while his servants, puzzled, asked why he had stopped fasting immediately after the child's death. David replied that while the child was alive, he could plead for mercy, but once dead, he could no longer bring him back. The mourning was contained in that gesture, and life in the palace continued with the memory of that prophetic sentence. After the child's death, David and Bathsheba had another son, Solomon, although the narration of this episode remained marked by the weight of the punishment that had fallen on an innocent. Jesus allows demons to kill 2,000 pigs. Upon arriving in the region of the Gadarenes, Jesus and his disciples were met by a man possessed whose behavior had terrorized the entire area. He lived among the tombs, broke the chains that were used to restrain him, and wounded himself with stones, crying out day and night. When he saw Jesus approaching, he ran to him and fell down, but he did not speak with his own voice. An impure spirit spoke through him, aware of the power before him. Jesus commanded the spirit to leave the man, but first asked his name. The answer was unsettling: "Legion, for we are many." The demons, fearing being sent into the abyss, begged Jesus to allow them to enter a nearby herd of pigs grazing on the hillside. Jesus granted the request. Immediately the spirits left the man and entered the animals. The reaction was immediate and violent. The pigs, out of control, ran toward the cliff and threw themselves into the sea, where they drowned. There were about 2,000. The herders fled to the town and surrounding fields to report what had happened. When people returned with them, they found the man who had been possessed sitting, clothed and in his right mind. The scene, instead of bringing joy, caused fear. The economic loss of the herd and the power displayed before their eyes made them ask Jesus to leave the region. The freedman wanted to follow him, but Jesus asked him to stay and recount what had happened. Thus, the event left a mark on the region, with the echo of the animals falling into the sea and the subsequent silence of the man who had once lived among the tombs. Hate your family to follow Jesus. As Jesus traveled the roads of Galilee and Judea, crowds began to follow him, drawn by his teachings, his healings, and the authority with which he spoke. However, among those followers were many who accompanied him out of curiosity or fleeting enthusiasm. In that context, Jesus pronounced a phrase that surprised by its harshness and marked a clear boundary between superficial admiration and absolute commitment. He said that whoever wanted to be his disciple must hate their father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and even their own life. The term was not softened in the text. It appeared as it was, abrupt, provocative, focused on showing that following him implied loyalty above any human bond. Family, which in Jewish culture occupied a central and sacred place, was subordinated to a devotion that had to be total. The statement was accompanied by another equally demanding image. Whoever did not carry their own cross could not be his disciple, anticipating the extreme sacrifice that following in his steps would entail. These words were addressed to a crowd that still did not understand the magnitude of the path Jesus was walking. He was not speaking to a small group of disciples, but to anyone considering following him. The instruction was public and left no room for comfortable interpretations. The contrast between loyalties was exposed with starkness. Jesus added examples to illustrate what that decision entailed. A man building a tower must calculate if he has the resources to finish it, and a king going to war must assess if he can face a larger army. Whoever did not consider the cost, he said, would be left halfway. Likewise, whoever did not renounce everything they had could not be his disciple. The message ended without further explanations, leaving the crowd with a phrase that shattered the traditional family structure and demanded total and unconditional commitment. Jonah swallowed by a great fish. Jonah received a direct order. He was to go to Nineveh, a city known for its violence, and announce that its wickedness had reached God. Instead of obeying, the prophet decided to flee in the opposite direction. He went down to the port of Joppa and found a ship heading to Tarshish, far from the mission entrusted to him. He paid the fare and boarded, trying to escape the divine presence while the sea remained calm. During the journey, a sudden storm struck the vessel. The sailors, experienced at sea, understood that something supernatural was happening. They threw the cargo into the water to lighten the ship, and each cried out to their gods. Jonah, meanwhile, was sleeping in the hold. The captain woke him and urged him to ask his God for help. The sailors cast lots to find out who was responsible for the disaster, and the lot fell on Jonah. Admitting that he was fleeing from the divine command, Jonah asked to be thrown into the sea to stop the storm. Although the sailors tried to reach the shore by rowing against the tempest, they finally threw him overboard. The sea immediately calmed. At that moment, a great fish, described without further details, swallowed him. Jonah remained inside for 3 days and 3 nights in total darkness, surrounded by an environment that defied all human understanding. In that place, the prophet prayed, describing his situation as if he had descended to the depths of death. When his plea ended, God commanded the fish to vomit Jonah onto dry land. Without delay, the prophet went to Nineveh to fulfill the instruction he had tried to avoid. The episode ended with Jonah cast upon the shore, covered in sea remnants, alive after an impossible confinement. Unequal treatment of women. In the laws and narratives of the Old Testament, women often appeared in a subordinate position within the social structure of Israel. Legislation on ritual purity provided a clear example. After giving birth, a woman was considered impure for a period that varied according to the sex of the newborn. The purification period was twice as long if the child was a girl, reflecting a distinction that went beyond the biological and entered symbolic categories of value and function. Marriages, on the other hand, were governed by family agreements in which the woman's voice carried little weight. In cases of rape, the law stipulated that if a man forcibly took an unmarried virgin, he had to pay a bride price and marry her without the possibility of divorce. The victim thus became bound for life to her aggressor, as the act was seen as a transgression against family honor rather than a direct affront to her integrity. Inheritance law also showed inequalities. Daughters could only inherit if there were no male children, and even then, under specific conditions aimed at keeping the land within the paternal clan. The paternal or male figure predominated in economic and family decisions, and women were under the guardianship of their father, husband, or closest male relative. In some ritual sacrifices, women had to present obligatory offerings after childbirth or in situations of impurity, reinforcing the idea that certain natural processes required atonement. In historical narratives, women often appeared as symbols of vulnerability in wartime, being taken as spoils or given in political alliances. These elements, intertwined in laws, narratives, and customs, showed a system where inequality was part of the social and religious organization, without nuance or additional justification in the text.